I'm Kirsty Lauder and I'm here to talk to you today about ADHD at work. And this is part of my PhD research that I'm going to go through, and I just want to say a special thank you to Joe and Rachel for inviting me to speak. If you need to contact me afterwards, if you have any questions or comments, then that's my email address and Twitter handle there. So a bit about me. I've been at Birkbeck for a while. I studied for my master's distance learning in occupational psychology with Birkbeck, and then I've just completed my PhD, so I'm an associate tutor as well. So I lead some seminars in all kinds of modules in organisational psychology. So you might have come across me then. So I've been at Birkbeck for a while and I really have enjoyed my time there, so much so that I'm now working as a Post-Doctorate in the Centre for Neurodiversity research at work. So that's a bit about me. What I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to start with, well, what is ADHD? Then I'm going to talk about the challenges and strengths associated with ADHD, what kind of workplace support is available, and then I'll go more into detail about my PhD. So I kind of framed it within the evidence-based management system or process, and then I'm going to talk about my findings from that, practical applications, and then future directions. So, what is ADHD? So it's a neurodevelopmental condition that's kind of classified or diagnosed through three major symptoms, and these are attention regulation. You'll often see this as inattention, when actually it's not the ability to not pay attention, it's difficulties with attention regulation, hyperactivity and impulsivity. So you don't have to have hyperactivity to receive a diagnosis of ADHD. And ADHD has only recently been considered to continue to adulthood. So before it was thought that it was just a childhood diagnosis and that actually ADHD just disappeared in teenage years. But what really people saw in the early 1990s was that symptoms or this kind of hyperactivity changed. It was more inside, and it would present differently, like impulsivity would change. So we've realised that actually it continues all the way through to adulthood. And other symptoms that are associated with ADHD are difficulties with social interactions and emotional regulation. And ADHDers are more likely to experience anxiety and depression. And what does this mean for the workplace? So one study showed that 3.5% of the global workforce met the criteria for ADHD. And global prevalence rates are between 2, 5, 7% for adult ADHD. So there's lots of ADHDers out there. And it's estimated annually that there are 32 days of lost productivity based on these challenges with experiencing attention regulation, hyperactivity and impulsivity. But that doesn't really translate very well to the workplace. So what does this look like? So the common workplace challenges, the most common are time management and organisation. So lateness, missing deadlines on projects, etc. Procrastination, so putting off starting or finishing projects. Easily distracted. Restlessness, which might be inner restlessness, and that might manifest like wrapping your leg around the chair, trying not to move, but always feeling driven by a motor. And then there can be challenges with co-workers and leaders. So following leadership is a challenge. And then there's the associated co-occurring mental health conditions like anxiety, depression and burnout. But the neurodiversity movement has really aimed to shift the way we think about differences and cognitive variation as part of the natural variation like biodiversity. And actually, there's lots of strengths associated with having ADHD. The big one is creativity, then there's resilience, passion, work ethic, courage, really good visual spatial ability, make great leaders, high risk-taking, and then hyper-focusing, which is what I was explaining about earlier, about attention regulation, that actually, if something is boring, then it doesn't get a lot of attention, and it can be difficult to maintain attention on that for ADHDers. But actually, if it's something that's interesting, you can hyper-focus or focus on it so much that you can forget to eat, go to the toilet, have a drink, etc. So there's lots of strengths associated and lots of careers associated with these strengths. So what support can we provide for the challenges? And reasonable adjustments are a legal requirement for employers. Every employee or worker has the right to request a reasonable adjustment in the workplace. And these are changes to typically the environment that enable the person to access work, thrive at work. It is often assumed that these adjustments are quite expensive and they're really difficult to implement. But actually, this isn't the case. Many of them are actually supportive for all. So these might be flexible working, job sharing, working from home, for example, which we've all done a lot of lately. And then these adjustment requests typically go to the managers or human resources department. So that's something to bear in mind that I'll come back to later. So my question in my PhD research was really, well, what makes an effective adjustment for ADHD? What are they? What's out there? And evidence-based management argues that you should value your decisions, or any decision you make should go through a certain process where you should ask the question or identify a problem in the organisation. You acquire and appraise all the evidence or the information about how you might answer that question. So you acquire it, and it might be from lots of different sources like stakeholders, etc. And then you appraise it, so you look at how good the quality of information is. And then you aggregate all this information and say, okay, what's a potential solution to my problem? And then you apply a solution, you assess or evaluate the solution, and then you start again because it's iterative. So you would ask, okay, so this is my answer to this question. Have I got any more questions from this? So my question was, what is an effective adjustment for ADHD? So I looked at the literature and the practical advice. So I did a systematic review of the literature and a meta-analysis just to see what was out there, what kind of information was available that could be applied to the workplace as well. And then I looked at practical advice. So I looked at online websites that were advising employers or employees with ADHD. And then I said, okay, well, how useful is this? Is literature and practice talking to each other? And is it of good quality? Is there a lot of information? How do we work out which is best, or what does it really mean? And that's when I aggregated it all together and I came up with a potential solution, which was I provided an e-learning program, or evaluated an e-learning program to increase awareness about ADHD. So I'll just explain a bit how I got there and the findings along the way. So to start, I did a systematic review of all the studies that looked at adult ADHD and the interventions available to them. When I started out on the journey, I thought, okay, so I'll look at any that are linked to the workplace. But out of 161 studies that evaluated interventions for adult ADHD, only one of them kind of spoke about the workplace, and that was simulating the workplace in a lab. So none actually looked at work specifically or designed an intervention that was specific for work, which was quite big. So there's a massive gap there. And what the majority of the studies looked at was the effectiveness of medication, which we know has very short-term benefits and targets mostly those core symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So how does this really transfer to the workplace? And so then I looked at, okay, so some of the studies included work-relevant outcomes, so measures that looked at whether organisation or time management improved, or work functioning, so productivity and performance. And then it wasn't many studies, so it's 23 studies that looked at that, and then I compared whether there was a difference in effect size for medication versus psychosocial interventions like CBT. And those psychosocial interventions that are easily transferable to the workplace, arguably, than medication, had a larger effect size. What other kind of mechanisms were involved in the interventions that made them more effective? So one that really stuck out was psychoeducation. And this is learning about how your brain works differently, or how it might be different, and other people learning about how you might be different as well. And this was a key mechanism in the effectiveness. And key recommendations through medical bodies or medical boards for how best to support ADHD recommend that a combination of pharmacological and psychosocial interventions are advised, but this is less present in the literature. So not as many studies looked at, okay, when we put them together, which is best. So that's the kind of key findings from this piece of research. And then I looked at the practical advice online. So I analysed 27 websites using template analysis, just to see whether there was a difference between what the research was saying and what practice was saying, because practitioners and reasonable adjustments are happening in the workplace right now. And if there's nothing in the research and we're told to make evidence-based decisions, how are we doing that? What's happening? So there were two general assumptions in the websites. One, or in some of them, not all of them. One was the kind of misconceptions of ADHD as a mental health condition, which can be quite dangerous because a mental health condition can go away over time, whereas ADHD is a lifelong condition. So it kind of contributes to the stigma associated with that. And then there was the position of the expert, like, I'm going to rescue you, or I'm going to tell you about your ADHD, and that's how it's going to be. So there wasn't a lot of content created by ADHDers themselves. And most of the recommendations are only really applicable to if you work in an office, which we know from the strengths associated with ADHD and the kind of careers that ADHDers go into, they're not typically done in an office, or that's not where they thrive. Many of the recommendations were task-based, so looking at that organisation, time management, memory, reward systems, targeting those, which seemed to work well. But it also highlighted the importance of policies and procedures. And again, similar to the kind of literature, in that flexible working, part-time, working from home works well for everyone, not just ADHDers. And then actually strengths were mentioned more in the online advice than in the literature. So there's less literature about the neurodiversity perspective of ADHD and how this might influence work. And on the online advice there is. There was also kind of an emphasis on how you need to be in the right job that suits your strengths and interests and how that's best. And then managers were clearly playing a key role in support for ADHD. So managers were expected to know about ADHD, to know about the support available for ADHD, and know how to implement reasonable adjustments, which is quite a lot for managers to take on. So then I thought, okay, I've aggregated the evidence, there's not a lot of it, and actually managers and HR professionals clearly are key decision makers in the kind of support that ADHDers are going to get. And I did a survey to kind of work out what that decision process is like, and I found that actually stereotypes influence whether or not people will accept or grant the adjustment scenario. So I gave lots of different vignettes or scenarios on different disabilities, and I said, would you as a manager grant this or not, and why? And that why really highlighted actually people were making decisions based on some stereotypes that they thought about reasonable adjustments themselves being expensive or difficult to implement, but also stereotypes about the kind of conditions. So I looked at whether neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD and autism differ to mental health conditions, or are they treated the same compared to physical disabilities, because there's an existing argument in the literature that mental health conditions are treated differently in a worse way. They're less likely to be granted than physical disabilities because they're hidden, because that invisible disability influences that kind of skepticism. And I found that these assumptions can negatively impact the support available, and this is consistent with the literature, and this influences self-worth, performance negatively, and negatively influences social interactions at work because of the assumptions that it might pose problems with other colleagues. So these are quotes from the qualitative data I collected. So I thought, okay, what do we do about this? And actually, it was clear that awareness needs to increase about ADHD, especially as it's only recently been considered a disorder that continues to adulthood. And lots of people do not know that they have ADHD. I think the latest statistic is 80% of people with ADHD don't know that they have it. But also managers of this and HR professionals are really key decision makers, and their awareness also needs to be increased. So I developed an e-learning program which aimed to increase knowledge on neurodiversity, reasonable adjustments and ADHD specifically. And I had a control group, which was a waiting list, and nobody knew that the study was about, or the e-learning program was specifically about ADHD. They were told it was just about neurodiversity and they were interested to learn more, which was also interesting because lots of people assume that neurodiversity, when we talk about neurodiversity, we're talking about autism. So, as you can see from the graphs, the e-learning program did increase knowledge about reasonable adjustments and ADHD at time 2, so after the program was completed. And it didn't really do anything different to the control group, who were just waiting for access to the e-learning program. And it increased the granting of reasonable adjustments more generally, and really increased the adjustments for mental health condition. But it didn't have a great effect on ADHD itself. But this was already quite high. There was high knowledge, as you can see. There was quite more positive attitude towards disabilities in this group. So they were already granting reasonable adjustments quite a lot anyway. So perhaps the program wasn't really targeting the people who needed the awareness the most. And actually, I think I found that the people who didn't grant the adjustments dropped out of the study. So actually, it really wasn't targeting the right people. And this is common in any kind of diversity evaluation program where you can increase awareness, but whether that translates to practice is another key challenge. So it had a good effect, but not perfect. Okay, so what does all this mean? So some practical implications for supporting ADHDers at work. So we need to increase the awareness and understanding of the bias, the assumptions and the stereotypes that influence our decision making. And this might be something as simple as not thinking that a person is suitable for the job based on their condition. So for example, someone with autism can't have a job that requires social interaction because autistics don't like social interaction, which is untrue and an assumption. We need to consider this interpretation of the right fit, and that's just what I mentioned. And also, for a person with a disability to access adjustments, they need to disclose that they have a condition or that they have a disability, and they need to disclose that they need help. And we know that it's very difficult to disclose if you're worried about stereotypes, especially about your performance, for example. And workplace culture is really important in encouraging disclosure. We need to encourage evidence-based decisions. We also need the research there to make the evidence-based decisions. So we need more research. But we also need to encourage this. And for adjustments, actually coaching has the strongest evidence so far. Include the person in any adjustment decisions. They're the person that's going to get the adjustment. They know their themselves best, and every adjustment should be personalised and consider strengths, not just what the person can't do. There's financial support for adjustments through Access to Work, which is a government-run scheme in the UK. So that's something that is worth looking into. I think it's free for small businesses. We need to consider co-occurrence. So ADHD often cannot just happen on its own. So there's co-occurring mental health conditions, but there's also might be co-occurring other neurodevelopmental conditions or learning difficulties like dyslexia, for example, or autism. And then example adjustments for ADHD, typically assistive technology, coaching, looking at job design. So do we really have to sit in an hour-long meeting does anyone? And without any kind of summary of notes after or key points? we need to look at how jobs are designed in that sense. You know, do we really need these kind of key elements for someone to perform well? And then the policies that support everyone, not just ADHDers. So really my message was that we need to stop focusing on, especially in the literature, on just trying to change the person with ADHD to be less like they are. So medication, for example, trying to address those core symptoms. And actually we need to address everyone around the employee, as an adjustment really is changes to the environment, and that includes managers and colleagues. So research really needs to catch up with that. And more focus on the workplace context, so what this might look like in work, what support works, what doesn't work. More on neurodiversity and utilising strengths. More research on assessing the effectiveness of these adjustments. And then a consideration of intersectionality in research and practice. And then bridging this gap. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about my research, and if you have any questions, please do ask them via email, Twitter. I'll put my handle out at the end. And here is some further reading if you are interested. So this really, I highlight the first two as really important pieces of research that are very recent, coming out of the Centre for Neurodiversity at Work, and then some more about ADHD, and then some more about kind of the adjustment process itself. But thank you for your attention, and see you for now.